Tinubu tried to choke Burkina Faso. Traore called it what it was: colonialism reborn. For decades, borders were used to starve nations into submission. And when Nigeria's president threatened to tighten his country's borders with Burkina Faso, everyone knew the playbook: submit or starve, bow or be crushed. But this time was different. This was not a border threat. It was economic warfare. And Captain Ibrahim Traoré refused to bow. From ECOWAS blockades to border threats, the same colonial playbook, just a new actor. Tinubu played the strong man, but Traoré made him look like Paris's enforcer. Abuja wanted fear, but they got defiance, and a continent heard Traoré's roar. When the young captain went on live television and declared, "This is not diplomacy. This is colonial bullying dressed in modern suits," his words didn't just challenge Nigeria's power. They challenged 60 years of African silence. Tinubu turned Nigeria's power against Africa. Traoré turned it into a rallying cry. This was not diplomacy. It was bullying, and Traoré made the world watch. Within hours, Nigeria's foreign ministry was scrambling. ECOWAS was in emergency session. And across Africa, people were asking the same question that would define a continent: had a young captain just broken the code of silence that kept Africa divided? History will call this moment the day a young captain called Africa's bully by name. But in those first chaotic hours after Traoré's declaration, no one knew if his defiance would spark a revolution or destroy his country. The answer would come at 3:17 a.m., when the phone rang in Ouagadougou. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. That phone call would change everything. Traoré was reviewing security reports when his communications director burst into the room, phone in hand, face pale with urgency. "Sir, Nigeria's making an announcement. You need to see this." On the screen, Nigeria's foreign affairs minister stood at a podium in Abuja, flanked by ECOWAS officials. His words were measured, but the message was brutal. Nigeria reserves the right to review all bilateral agreements with nations that threaten regional stability. This includes border protocols, trade agreements, and economic partnerships. Everyone knew what that meant. Nigeria controlled West Africa's largest economy, its busiest ports, and the region's most crucial trade routes. When Nigeria closed its borders, countries didn't just lose trade, they lost lifelines. Traoré's advisors exchanged worried glances. Burkina Faso imported 60% of its fuel through Nigerian routes. Medicines, machinery, even basic goods flowed through Lagos and Port Harcourt before reaching Ouagadougou. A border closure wouldn't just hurt, it would cripple. "They want me to call Tinubu and apologize," Traoré said quietly, setting down the phone. "Promise to reverse our position on the foreign bases, maybe even consider rejoining their ECOWAS meetings." His defense minister leaned forward. "Sir, pragmatically speaking." "Pragmatically?" Traoré's voice hardened. "You mean bow down, kiss the ring, promise to be a good boy while they decide our country's future?" The room fell silent. Outside, the morning call to prayer echoed across Ouagadougou, a reminder that some things couldn't be bought, sold, or negotiated away. "Get me the television studio," Traoré ordered. "If they want to play power games, let's show them what real power looks like." But as his team scrambled to arrange the broadcast, none of them could have predicted what would happen next. By noon, word had leaked. Nigerian traders at Burkina's borders received quiet instructions to prepare for potential disruptions. Fuel truck drivers were told their permits might be under review. The economic noose was tightening before Traoré had even responded. In Abuja, President Tinubu's inner circle was confident. This was the same strategy that had worked on Mali, on Guinea, on every African leader who dared step out of line. Economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, then a quiet phone call offering a face-saving compromise. Traoré's young, Tinubu's chief of staff, remarked during their morning briefing. "He'll understand the mathematics. Nigeria's economy is 6 times larger than Burkina's. We buy their products, we supply their fuel. He needs us more than we need him." But in Ouagadougou, mathematics looked different. Traoré stood before his cabinet. A map of Africa spread across the conference table. His finger traced the borders, lines drawn by European colonizers, now being weaponized by African leaders. Every generation faces a moment, he began, his voice steady but intense. A moment where they choose between comfort and conscience, between survival and dignity, between being subjects or being free. His foreign minister, a veteran diplomat, cleared his throat. Captain, with respect, there are ways to handle this quietly. Back-channel negotiations, face-saving compromises. Face-saving for whom? Traore cut him off. For me? Or for the millions of Africans who are tired of watching their leaders grovel every time a bigger neighbor snaps their fingers? He turned to face the room. They think this is about trade agreements and border protocols. But this is about something bigger. This is about whether Africa will ever truly be free, or if we'll just keep changing the color of our colonial masters. The television crew was setting up in the presidential palace. In 3 hours, Traore would address not just Burkina Faso, but all of Africa. What he said next would either end his political career or begin something unprecedented. But first, his phone was ringing. The caller ID showed one name: Tinubu. Ibrahim. Tinubu's voice was warm, almost fatherly. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Traore had put the call on speaker, his entire cabinet listening. Mr. President, you threatened to strangle my country's economy. How much simpler should I make it? A pause. Look, we both know how this game works. You've had your moment of defiance, shown your people you're strong. Now we find a quiet solution. Maybe you walk back some of the more inflammatory statements about Western presence in the region. In return, trade continues as normal. And if I refuse? Another pause, longer this time, then you'll learn what isolation really means. Ask Mali how it felt when their people couldn't get medicine. Ask Guinea how their economy performed when their ports were closed. This isn't personal. Ibrahim, it's just business. Traore looked around the room at his ministers' faces, some fearful, some angry, all waiting for his response. Through the window he could see Ouagadougou's bustling streets, vendors selling goods that might disappear, families living lives that might soon become much harder. You know what, Bola? Traore's voice changed, became almost conversational. You're absolutely right. This is business, colonial business. The same business model that's kept Africa poor for centuries. Divide us, threaten us, make us compete for scraps from the master's table. Ibrahim, you're being dramatic.
Am I?
Or am I being honest? Traore stood up, pacing now. Tell me, when France threatens sanctions, do you call it dramatic? When the IMF demands structural adjustments, is that just business? But when Nigeria does it to Burkina Faso, we should smile and say thank you? The line went quiet. Traore could hear Tinubu breathing, calculating. You're making a mistake, Tinubu finally said. A very expensive mistake. Maybe, Traore replied. But it's my mistake to make. And Mr. President, when I address my people today, I'm going to tell them exactly what you just told me. Every word. The line went dead. Across the room, his foreign minister was shaking his head. Captain, you've just declared economic war on West Africa's largest economy. Traore smiled grimly. No, I've just refused to surrender without a fight. At 6 p.m. Ouagadougou time, television screens across West Africa flickered to life. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat behind a simple wooden desk. No flags, no ceremonial grandeur. Just a young man with fire in his eyes and a message that would change everything. My fellow Burkinabe, my fellow Africans, he began. Today, I received a threat disguised as diplomacy. Nigeria's government has decided that because we refuse to host foreign military bases on our soil, because we dare to chart our own course, they will use their economic power to force us back in line. In Lagos, Abuja, and across Nigeria, viewers leaned forward. This wasn't the usual diplomatic language of African politics. They call this regional leadership. I call it what it is, colonial bullying with a black face. The words hit like a thunderbolt. In Nigeria, government officials frantically called television stations, demanding the feed be cut. But it was too late. The speech was streaming live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. Every major news network across Africa was carrying it. For too long, we have accepted that might makes right in Africa, that the biggest economy gets to decide the fate of smaller ones, that borders drawn by colonizers should be used as weapons by our own leaders. Traore's voice rose, passionate but controlled. When France sanctioned us, we called it imperialism. When America freezes assets, we call it bullying. But when Nigeria threatens to strangle our economy unless we submit, we're supposed to call it diplomacy? In Ghana, Kenya, Tanzania, people gathered around phones and televisions, sharing clips, translating for family members. The hashtag Traore speaks true began trending in English, French, Hausa, Swahili. I have a message for President Tinubu and any African leader who thinks economic blackmail is leadership. We will not bow. We will not beg. We will not trade our dignity for temporary comfort. The camera zoomed in slightly as Traore leaned forward. To my fellow Africans watching this, in Nigeria, in Ghana, in Mali, in every corner of our continent, know that borders are not chains. Trade is not submission. And unity does not mean uniformity. He paused, letting the words sink in. They want us to believe we must choose between Pan-Africanism and sovereignty. That's a false choice, designed to keep us weak. Real African unity means respecting each nation's right to chart its own course. But as powerful as his words were, Traore had saved his strongest statement for last. President Tinubu. Traore said, looking directly into the camera, "You have 48 hours to clarify your position. Will you respect Burkina Faso's sovereignty, or will you confirm that Nigeria's foreign policy is written in Paris and Washington?" The audacity was breathtaking. A captain from one of Africa's smallest economies had just challenged the continent's biggest power, publicly, directly, with the entire world watching. Because if you choose to close those borders, if you choose to weaponize trade against a fellow African nation, you won't just be punishing Burkina Faso. You'll be showing every African exactly what you think of African unity. In the Nigerian presidential villa, emergency meetings were already underway. Tinubu's advisors were divided. Some demanded immediate retaliation. Others worried about the optics of a continental superpower crushing a small neighbor. "He's made this personal," Tinubu's foreign minister argued. "We can't let this stand. Every other African leader will think they can disrespect Nigeria." But his communications directors saw the bigger picture. "Sir, he's winning the narrative war. Social media is exploding. Colonial bullying is trending worldwide. If we close those borders now, we look like exactly what he called us." Meanwhile, Traore wasn't finished. "To the people of Nigeria, I want to be clear. This is not about you. You are our brothers and sisters. This is about leaders who use your economy, your resources, your strength to bully other Africans instead of lifting them up." The camera pulled back slightly as Traore stood. "And to every African leader watching, remember that the same powers that divided us centuries ago are still dividing us today. They just use economic pressure instead of military force. And sometimes they use our own leaders instead of foreign armies." His final words would be replayed millions of times across social media. Africa will never be free until every African nation is free to choose its own path. Tonight, Burkina Faso chooses dignity over comfort, sovereignty over submission. We invite you to choose with us. The broadcast ended, but across Africa, something had begun that neither Traore nor Tinubu could control. The people were waking up. Within 6 hours of Traore's speech, African social media exploded. Videos poured in from across the continent. Young people in Lagos, holding signs reading, "We are not colonial enforcers." University students in Nairobi, debating sovereignty versus economic pragmatism. Market women in Accra discussing whether big African countries should bully smaller ones. But the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. At 2 a.m. Nigerian time, a video appeared on Twitter. No fancy production. Just a young woman sitting in what looked like a Lagos apartment, speaking directly to her phone camera. "My name is Funmi Adebayo. I'm Nigerian. And I'm embarrassed." The video would be viewed 12 million times in the next 24 hours. Captain Traore spoke truth tonight. When we use our size to bully other African countries, how are we different from the colonial powers we claim to reject? Similar videos began appearing across Nigeria. Not organized, not coordinated, just ordinary Nigerians expressing their discomfort with their government's tactics. In Abuja, President Tinubu's team watched the social media storm with growing alarm. This wasn't supposed to happen. Africans were supposed to stay in their lanes, handle disputes quietly, maintain the established order. Sir, his chief of staff reported during the 4 a.m. emergency meeting. We have a problem. It's not just Burkina Faso anymore. The story is spreading. CNN Africa is calling it the speech that challenged African leadership. Al Jazeera is running a special on economic colonialism in West Africa. Tinubu rubbed his temples. What are our options? We close the borders as planned and weather the criticism, or we find a face-saving way to back down. Backing down makes us look weak to every other African leader. But closing the borders now makes us look like bullies to every African citizen. It was a lose-lose situation, and everyone in the room knew it. But 800 miles away in Ouagadougou, Traore was facing his own crisis. His economic advisors had run the numbers. A Nigerian border closure would be devastating. Fuel shortages within a week, food price increases within a month, potential social unrest within 2 months. Captain, his finance minister said quietly, the people are rallying behind the message, but they'll still need to eat, they'll still need medicine. Dignity doesn't power hospitals or feed children. Traore stared at the economic projections. So you're saying I should have stayed silent? Let them threaten us and smile while they did it? I'm saying there might have been a middle ground. The middle ground is where Africa has been stuck for 60 years. Traore replied, maybe it's time to try something different. But as dawn broke over both Ouagadougou and Abuja, both leaders faced the same question. What happens when unstoppable rhetoric meets immovable economic reality? The 48-hour deadline approached like a storm. Across Africa, people waited. In universities, in markets, in government offices, the same question echoed, would Tinubu blink, or would Traore break? But the answer came from neither capital. At 10 a.m. on the day of the deadline, something unprecedented happened. A joint statement appeared simultaneously on the websites of Kenya's Daily Nation, South Africa's Mail and Guardian, Ghana's Joy News, and a dozen other major African media outlets. It was signed by 23 African heads of state. We, the undersigned, call for dialogue over confrontation, cooperation over coercion. African disputes should be resolved through African solutions, not economic warfare. The signatories included some surprising names: leaders who had never criticized Nigeria publicly, allies who had supported previous ECOWAS interventions. But Traore's speech had changed the political calculus. No African leader wanted to be seen supporting economic bullying, regardless of their private views. In Abuja, Tinubu read the statement with growing frustration. His continental isolation was complete. In Ouagadougou, Traore felt vindicated but cautious. The diplomatic victory was clear, but the economic threat remained. The resolution, when it came, surprised everyone. At 3 p.m., exactly 1 hour before his own deadline, Traore called a press conference. Standing before the same camera that had carried his defiant speech to the world, he spoke again. 48 hours ago, I challenged President Tinubu to choose between respect and coercion. Today, I make a different choice. I choose dialogue. The statement was carefully crafted, offering just enough diplomatic space for both leaders to save face. Burkina Faso remains committed to African sovereignty and dignity. We also remain committed to African brotherhood. We invite President Tinubu to join us in building a new model of African relations, one based on mutual respect rather than economic intimidation. 2 hours later, Tinubu responded with his own statement. Nigeria has always supported dialogue and diplomatic solutions. We welcome Burkina Faso's commitment to regional peace and look forward to continued cooperation. The border threat quietly disappeared. No formal announcement, no dramatic gestures, it simply vanished from the diplomatic agenda. But the impact of those 48 hours would last much longer. 6 months later, when France threatened economic sanctions against Mali, 15 African nations issued a joint statement of support for Malian sovereignty. When the IMF demanded structural adjustments from Ghana, African economists publicly questioned the requirements. When Chad faced pressure to host foreign military bases, Chadian students marched with signs reading, "Our sovereignty is not negotiable." The language had changed. The expectations had changed. African leaders could no longer bully each other without continental scrutiny. Foreign powers could no longer assume African silence in the face of economic pressure. Traore's speech hadn't just challenged Nigeria. It had challenged the entire post-colonial African political order. And while that order didn't collapse overnight, it began to crack in ways that would reshape the continent for generations. In Ouagadougou, tourists now visit the presidential palace where the speech was delivered. A plaque marks the room where a young captain looked into a camera and told Africa it didn't have to choose between dignity and survival. In Abuja, political scientists still debate whether Tinubu's restraint was wisdom or weakness. But they all agree on one thing. The old rules of African diplomacy died in those 40. The question now isn't whether Africa will be free. It's how long freedom will take, and how much courage its leaders will show along the way. History will call this moment the day a young captain called Africa's bully by name. But more importantly, it was the day Africa started calling itself by a new name, sovereign. The borders remain. The trade continues. The relationships endure. But the fear is gone. And sometimes, that changes everything.